Yeah. So on this day, 35 years ago, the Republic of South Africa rejoiced the future with the release of Mandela from prison. But have we lived up to the hopefulness that the country certainly had on this day 35 years ago? Well, that's what we're hoping to hear from you. Give us a call on 010-594-6010 or send us a WhatsApp on 0721105584. We're joined by the Nelson Mandela Foundation's CEO, Dr. Mbongiseni Buthelezi. We're joined by the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation's board member, Dr. Rekgotsofetse Chikane, from the FW de Klerk Foundation's Constitutional Advancement Manager, Ismail Joosub, also joining us, and we're joined by anti-apartheid activist, Mr. Mac Maharaj. Gentlemen, a good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I must say that it's quite interesting watching, some of the representatives from various foundations joining us on this panel. I'm certainly not going to pretend to guess your ages, but, the foundations all represented by fairly young men. And 35 years ago, I mean, that's a fully grown adult man who's very active in the economy. So it's a long time ago. And perhaps, Mr. Maharaj, then we start with you, to take us back as a country to what this day looked and felt like 35 years ago. If you see the images that certainly are available for us, I think about the crowds that gathered to see Nelson Mandela in 1990, images that are shared of people climbing up to get as close to him as possible. Talk to us about where you were and certainly what it felt like, the significance of this day 35 years ago.
The release of Madiba in 1990 capped a moment where hope was on the ascendancy. And the negotiations that resulted in the 1994 elections really opened the door where our people who had lived under a system which ghettoized our lives was now broken, and we were charged with building a new society. On that day, I was still operating in the underground as part of the commander of Operation Vula, and I was in a hideout in South Africa. I had just re-entered it after I had made a trip abroad, and I was overtaken by the awesome responsibility that we were now faced. The apartheid regime had been forced to unban the organizations, had been forced to agree to release political prisoners, and it was now opening the door to negotiations. We knew that the apartheid regime was still strong and in the seat of power. And the awesomeness of the challenges that we faced was that we would have to use every bit of our energy in the negotiations to deliver a democracy. So Mandela, at the lead of the ANC, charted a path which held up the idea of a non-racial, non-sexist democracy, one that is anchored on full and equal citizenship for all and an end to racial discrimination. And in that regard, he was of the view and anchored his thoughts on the rule of law and constitutionalism. Those were the issues that were bubbling up with the release. The country was filled with excitement. People who had struggled had risen in revolt over and over and again, and those revolts were being smashed by repressive state power. Troops were occupying our townships. People were no longer safe. Thousands were in hiding, and we had forced the regime to the table to open that door. So there was excitement and hope.
Yeah, excitement and hope. And I want to sit with that word, hope, because, obviously throughout this hour, we need to talk about hope for and finish off that sentence and really hear from our viewers as well if they feel that the end of that sentence has in fact seen enactment. But Dr. Buthelezi, I want to bring you in here with the institutional knowledge that you have within the Nelson Mandela Foundation, just how much, I suppose, interest there really is in what happened in the days that followed, certainly the years that followed, Mr. Mandela's release. I mean, I think about the speech that he gave on the day of his release, and he talks about negotiations on the, and I'm reading from his speech now, if you'll allow me, negotiations on the dismantling of apartheid will have to address the overwhelming demand of our people for a democratic, non-racial and unitary South Africa. There must be an end to white monopoly on political power, and a fundamental restructuring of our political and economic systems to ensure the inequalities of apartheid are addressed and our society are thoroughly democratized. I'm sure that a lot of the time you are asked about the clarification on what happened after Mandela's release, especially now that we're having such a big debate about land expropriation.
There is, I think, a great deal of interest in what happened, especially in that decade after his release. The interest, I think, is in, if we look back now from the vantage point of today, in both reflecting on and celebrating the successes of that first decade, but also, I think we must also look back at what could have been done better. If we look back from today, I think a lot of people who contact us, for example, or people who use our archive, are people who are interested in uncovering more of what we perhaps don't yet know about that period. But there's also a great deal of interest in reckoning with what happened since. So what happened since, of course, is there were major victories in terms of, if we look back at our constitution. The negotiations that Mr. Maharaj was talking about yielded, I think, what I think was a great success in 1994. I mean, I remember the day of the election in 1994 and my parents getting up and being able to go and vote for the first time. Of course, I mean, I was only 13 years old at the time. But the excitement that they felt just being able to vote for the first time. The constitution that arose out of that decade in 1996, and a slew of laws that were meant to set things right, to redress the imbalances of the past, of that racialized oppression of the past. But of course, if we look back from now, we also realize that there's a lot that has not gone to plan. There's a lot of missteps that have been made. And so we have to hold all that complexity together, I think, when we look back from the vantage point of today.
Yeah. Mr. Joosub, you've got an interesting job, right? Looking at the constitutional advancement at the F.W. de Klerk Foundation. In that speech when the former president, at the time, of course, he wasn't president, when he had been released on this day 35 years ago, he goes on to talk about how Mr. de Klerk has gone further than any other nationalist president in taking real steps to normalize the situation of our country. Just as an institution, talk to me about how you engage the matter of certainly starting to redress and see redress as a foundation when you think about the role that F.W. de Klerk certainly played in, you know, what position the foundation says, well, this is the direction we should be going now in dealing with the redress as the country continues to transition. Mr. Joosub, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, Naledi. You know, I have to say, I can't answer the question of what the 11th of February 1990 looked like. As a young man of but 25 years old, indeed, I was not there on that day. But as Dr. Buthelezi rightly touched on, there are lessons that can be learned from the 11th of February 1990. And these lessons must be learned, but must be imparted to the youth, to young people. I guess it is fitting that the F.W. de Klerk Foundation is represented on this discussion today because, indeed, President F.W. de Klerk and President Mandela share a commonality in that both of them have won the Nobel Peace Prize. And that must not be taken for granted. The fact that an historic compromise was achieved in South Africa, an historic compromise that led to the transformation of South Africa from an apartheid state into the constitutional democracy that we have today, was indeed historic. So the event on the 11th of February 1990 symbolized hope, symbolized unity, and, you know, I have to say as well, that these lessons that must be learned by young people, must not be forgotten. We stand on the shoulders of giants. Indeed, we have the responsibility now to take the baton on and to chart the path that Nelson Mandela's vision emboldens us to do. Now, touching on the vision of President Mandela, the vision that Nelson Mandela has for South Africa, the vision of a non-racial, an equal state, a state founded on the values of equality and dignity and human rights. These are all ideals that indeed form part of the founding values of the Constitution of South Africa. And I think very often in society today, all people seem either not to understand the Constitution being the birth document of our republic, and indeed being the living legacy of President Mandela and indeed President de Klerk, but seem to be complacent, seem to have a great malaise in our public institutions, seem to have a crisis of confidence in our leaders. I believe that the best way to honor the legacy of President Mandela is to continue on the road that indeed Madiba's legacy, but also the Constitution wants us to continue on.
You know, Dr. Chikane, I'm going to bring you in here because you're obviously a board member with the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. And here's the issue. We can certainly speak about the tenets of our democracy and constitutionalism, and I think those are all very important to discuss. But the irony of where we find ourselves right now as a country certainly is not lost on us. I mean, if you look at just the debates coming out of the SONA debate today, a lot of the conversations around expropriation and really redress, but also responding to how the US has now cut funds to South Africa as a result of this. And there's so many parallels that you can draw, really, to where we are as a country versus where we were 35 years ago, Dr. Chikane.
Yeah, I mean, I must first agree with all the previous speakers, but then also try and push the discussion just a little bit more. And it's really based on what you've just said. So as the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, I really encourage everyone to go onto our website. We run an essay competition every year where we encourage young people to really write about non-racialism and their understanding of it. And what you find out is that you find that a lot of young people have a very clear idea about what Nelson Mandela's belief around non-racialism is or was. The struggle that people have is how do you rationalize it with the reality of today? Right, where you're told that there's this idea that we are all equal, that we should be living in a just society, but then you must equally balance that idea that the majority of South Africans are in poverty, the majority of young people are unemployed, and we have the largest amount of inequality in the world, right, with gender-based violence at levels akin to war-torn countries. This is the reality that South Africans see every day in one way or another, yet they persist with trying to push for non-racialism. Right? It is not as if the country has completely fallen apart. It is not as if we are in the midst of a civil war. You can see that everyday South Africans are trying to rationalize this belief around how do we push the country forward. The challenges that we also face, though, becomes from this political rhetoric that come from people who want to have power in society, that mechanize race, right? That utilize it in a manner to divide people, right? Who utilize it in a manner to essentially say there are some people who are better than others. There is some sort of ideal South African, and then there are others. And when you mix that type of political rhetoric with the reality on the ground of indeed there is racial segregation at an economic, social, and cultural level in our country, you create a fertile ground for discontent within society. Fertile ground that politicians often will take advantage of. This recent incident with President Donald Trump and pulling back on all economic aid to South Africa, that was really spurred on by a sustained lobbying effort by certain individuals in the country, is testament to this idea that you can weaponize race to divide, rather than utilizing race to bring people together. And I think that's the challenge that South Africans are really facing in this day and age. And I think the real struggle that we're facing going forward is, how do you resist the temptation to go to the lowest common denominator argument of race is easy as a marker of difference, and therefore I'll use it to justify my actions against other people? And how do we bring South Africans to a higher level understanding of non-racialism is not an easy thing, that it is deeply entrenched in a very complicated country, but it is something that is worth fighting for. And I think that's something that Nelson Mandela would deeply believe in if he was still around today.
Yeah, you know what I'm keen to do, and as we take the conversation further, and perhaps Mr. Maharaj, you can assist us with this, with looking at the past 35 years, I mean, from 1990 going into the negotiations, 94, the beginning of our democratic dispensation. But I want to get to the touch points of where we did have green shoots of getting some of that I suppose that transition, right? Not just political, but also economic, where we've seen those opportunities. But we'll do that as well as we take our calls. Temba is calling in from Johannesburg. Temba, good evening.
Good evening. Good evening, ma'am. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you so much for calling. What are your thoughts on our discussion?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. The question that was posed was how do we see the country, the state of the country now, 35 years after the release of Madiba?
Absolutely. Yeah.
The country has made a lot of strides. To be honest, I'm a pessimistic person who usually look at the brighter side than looking at the negative side. We know that the country has just hit a lot of strides. And there were a lot of downfalls because of the change of dynamics in the country, like political dynamics, that forced the country to adjust to what is happening currently. But so far, so good. What we need to do going forward as the country is to put our heads above the waters and try to weather the storm that is coming. Because America, through the President of America, Donald Trump, all what he's doing now, he wants to tell us what to do, or to drive us what to do as the country. And we must not lose our sovereignty. This is the country that has got laws, that has got constitution, and we need to follow that to the letter without compromising anything. And for those that are negative about what the president of the country has pronounced, more especially the land question is very critical because we need to balance, we need to level the playing field. You know, if you look at the percentage, how many black people or African people that do not own the land in South Africa compared to the people in USA. If you do that, and USA has got laws as well. This land question, they are applying it in USA, but here they do not want us to do it. So for me, I'm very positive that we are on the right direction as long as we can just forge ahead with unity that Babu Madiba taught us, and he did it practically. This country must not go back from where we were in apartheid days. We have moved from that era, and we must just forge the way forward.
Yeah, thank you so much for you calling in, Temba. Temba in Johannesburg, they're quite optimistic. Keen to hear from more of you as well. Give us a call, 0105946010. The question we're asking is, today, 35 years on since the former President Nelson Mandela was released from prison, the hopefulness that the country had on that day, have we seen it see some fruition in 2025? We'll get in touch with more of our callers and continue with our panel on the other side of this short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. As we observe 35 years since the release of Nelson Mandela from prison, we reflect on where we are as a country 35 years on, the hopefulness, and I want to sit with that word, the hopefulness of that day. Have we seen it see some fruition? And we continue with our panel. Mr. Maharaj, I want to actually bring that last question I had before we went into the break to you, because with you, we have the benefit of you know, having been through as an anti-apartheid activist, but also having worked in some of the various governments that we've had. We've got presidents' foundations represented here. You at some point were spokesperson for President Jacob Zuma. The green shoots of transformation in 35 years that you think we really need to be focusing on as we also reflect on what has gone wrong?
Thank you very much. First of all, let me appreciate the direction that Dr. Chikane wants us to move into, because I think that that should be the dominant aspect of the political discourse in our country. Namely, what do we do to move forward? But in order to do that, it is also appropriate that we should look at the 30 years experience to see where we have made mistakes, whether they be mistakes of omission or commission. Because I believe personally that we learn better from our mistakes than from our achievements. But to learn from our mistakes needs a very sober mind. And I think that the issue today that faces our country is that we are more and more a divided country. There is a clear manifestation that creating a non-racial society is floundering. And there is a sense that the issue of race is intractable. Now, in addition to that, we have to recognize also that despite our commitment in our constitution to a non-sexist society, patriarchy remains deeply embedded in our society. The third point I would like to make is that, unfortunately, the level of political discourse at the moment is pretty low in the country. And it is imperative that we should be drawing in young people. And I'm so happy to see that I'm the one that is a dinosaur in today's panel. So that gives me a lot of hope. But I've come to this discussion asking myself for years now, where did we commit major mistakes? The easiest part looking back is to put the blame on Zuma. I think his years were a disaster for the country. But I do not think we should waste our time dwelling on that, because it was based on a corrupt state, on capture by corrupt people, and it was a squandering of our resources and a destruction of the state that we were busy building. For me, I have to criticize myself. And I look back and I say that the ANC under Mandela came into government in 1994 with a three-pronged program. The first of it was the reconstruction of our society and economy. The second one was to reconcile our people. The third one was to build a nation out of our diversity. And where I think we went wrong is Madiba was, I would say in quotes, a reluctant president. And he chose to devote his term to focusing on reconciliation and nation building. And also took a great interest in any possibilities of counter-revolution rearing its head in our country. The result was that in the cabinet clusters, Madiba didn't chair any of them, but F.W. de Klerk chaired the security and intelligence cluster. And Madiba made sure that he attended every one of those meetings. But the point I want to make here is that we separated these three legs, which were an integral part of one process, and we began to attend to them in separate silos so that people could not see the interconnection. And I think that is the start of our problem. There are other issues that will arise, but I would look forward to other colleagues in the discussion raising them.
Yeah.
I still think that those three aspects, the reconstruction of our society, socio-economic reconstruction, the reconciliation of our people, and the building of a nation, remain the critical agenda of the way forward. And what we have achieved in our Constitution of 1996 is to put into that Constitution the provisions that we are trying to build a society based on equality. We're trying to build it on the basis of the need for redress, on the basis that it is non-racial, non-sexist, and that it is a democratic, united country. So I think that when we interrogate the problems of the way forward, because I would respond on the issue that this is work in progress, that here you have a society that is still spatially separate. That imprint of colonialism and apartheid remains. Our people, the workforce, live furthest away from the workplace. We are still busing in kids to go into integrated schools. And therefore, we are still leading ghettoized lives. Despite the progress we've made, that imprint remains, and it is not an easy problem to overcome. I don't want to take more time. I would welcome more from my colleagues on the panel so that we can make this discussion into lessons of the past and what to do better as we go forward.
100%.
And what to focus on.
Yeah, and one of the things, of course, is going to be just the timeliness of transition, and you talk about that important part of really that goal, reconstruction of society and economy, Mr. Maharaj. Last year, towards the end of last year, we saw the Nelson Mandela Foundation filing a legal challenge against the state, Mr. Buthelezi, Dr. Buthelezi. This is over what you called a failure to deal with equitable access to land. And in fact, what you did as the Nelson Mandela Foundation is you gave the state, you said there must be some sort of actioning within 18 months. Well, here we are. The Land Expropriation Act has been signed, and what a reaction, not just within our own borders, but abroad as well. But talk to me about whether or not there was an expectation that this is where the conversation would take us, but also the timing of it. It's 30 years later into our democracy that the Mandela Foundation said, okay, now let's push forward.
So I think one of the failures that we see is that we've got this festering anger in South Africa because the land question has not been dealt with adequately. We have the instruments in law. We have land restitution, but we've just not gone far enough. There has not been sufficient transfer of land to move progressively towards the equity that was envisaged in the Constitution and in subsequent laws. And I think if we don't deal with this problem decisively, we are going to find ourselves in bigger problems. The riots of July 2021 will look like a picnic if we don't deal with this problem decisively. And that festering anger, I think Dr. Chikane is right. It's anger that is being used by political entrepreneurs for their own power plays, who manipulate people who they know are disaffected with where we've landed up on the land question and other things. Of course, socioeconomic transformation that Mr. Maharaj talks about has not been adequate in South Africa. I think we can all agree on that at this point. And if we don't do something about it and do it now, I think we're headed towards bigger problems than we have. Now, one of the ways in which we can force that conversation is through what we've done through launching that case. And we launched that case on the anniversary of Madiba's passing on the 5th of December last year. What that can do is to then begin the conversation again. And I think it's another moment of transition that we're in, especially with the government of national unity having come in. We can actually we have an opportunity to still make amends for things that we haven't reached. And I think the conversation that needs to start starts with that court case. If we all agree, I mean, we can now come around the table again, like was done in the 1990s through those negotiations, and say, we've made some fundamental mistakes. We've focused on land restitution, and what we've not looked at is land redistribution sufficiently, for example. What does it look like? If we continue at the rate at which land is being restituted, it's going to take another 200 years to get to the targets that were set in 1994 of how much land should be transferred, how much arable land, for example, should be transferred to Black people in South Africa. That hasn't happened in the first 30 years. And at the land at which our budget is being allocated by the state, it's going to take us more than 200 years to reach those targets of 1994. So there's a new conversation that we need to start. And we are trying to put that question firmly on the table. That requires that those groupings that Dr. Chikane has been talking about and talked about earlier, that have been going to the US lobbying, they are people that we also need to be in discussion with, much in the same way that Madiba and his colleagues, including Mr. Maharaj, brought people around the table in the 1990s to negotiate the transition. I think we're in that critical moment here again, where we need to start a new conversation, need to bring people around the table. And the Nelson Mandela Foundation, I think, is very well placed and is very well geared. Was geared by Madiba himself to be able to play that role, to be activist in ways in which we can move towards achieving some of the dreams of that transition of the 1990s. Yeah,
so 1990, I mean, what it characterized was a time of, like you're saying, Dr. Buthelezi, a moment where discussion needs to happen. What we heard from Sona, the president, saying this year that national dialogue is going to take place. I want to hear firstly, Mr. Joosub, if the FW de Klerk Foundation will be participating in that national dialogue. I think that's the first thing. And then the land question. Is the time now?
No, thank you for the question, Naledi. And simply the answer is yes, indeed. The FW de Klerk Foundation will optimistically participate in the national dialogue. In fact, a preparatory committee has been established, and the FW de Klerk Foundation proudly sits on that preparatory committee. I think it's absolutely vital, and as I mentioned before, to learn from the lessons of the past. And one of those preeminent lessons were that conflict can only be solved through constructive dialogue. This is indeed the lesson of President FW de Klerk and President Mandela. And so the national dialogue presents us with another historic opportunity to give the voice of all South Africans resonance in a platform, one specific platform. That being said, moving over to the land question, I'm inclined to agree with both Mr. Maharaj and Dr. Buthelezi. One of the biggest problems that South Africa has been experiencing over these last 30 or 35 years is the growing inequality gap in South Africa. Now, there are many ways to go about to bridge that gap. But I think we have to pay attention to the fact that any solution must be done in terms of the Constitution. And so I make no mistake about it that the FW de Klerk Foundation opposes the Expropriation Act as it stands simply because of its unconstitutionality when viewed in light of Section 25 of the Constitution. That's not us saying that we're against or we're opposed to reducing inequality or redressing the land issue in any other form, simply that we must realize that we have this preeminent law, we have this supreme law, the Constitution. It must be respected. And there are many ways about going about addressing inequality in South Africa. I think there are many other problems in South Africa. There are some green shoots as well over the last few decades. Mr. Maharaj mentioned the growing culture of patriarchy in South Africa. Indeed, that is true. But we've also seen the gender gap close. We have a parliament that is almost equally representative of both men and women. I think we've made great strides in education over the last few decades. 2 or 3 weeks ago, we celebrated the highest ever matric pass rate. These are all accomplishments, achievements that are necessary to be celebrated. But then Dr. Chikane touched on a very, very important point. And this is something I want to speak about just a little bit. The divisiveness within our society is still stark. It's still sadly apparent. And the groups that have lobbied President Trump and have now probably succeeded in President Trump, getting President Trump to sign an executive order, have sown seeds of discord among the population that is not constructive. Again, we must realize that the only way to solve problems in society is indeed to constructively dialogue and then come with one united voice as the citizens of South Africa, so that we understand that whatever we do is not against any one group of people, but that we act on a united front. This is why we support the government of national unity, because of unity. This is why we learn also from the lessons of the past, where President de Klerk and President Mandela joined hands together in a government of national unity.
Yeah.
I must lastly say that what we need now is a society that is fixated not only on solving all of our systemic issues, on solving the high rates of youth unemployment, the high rates of corruption, but focusing on the achievements of the last 30 years and building on that. And as you mentioned, giving back hope, and giving back hope especially to young people.
Okay.
And I think, yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. When we need to come back and deal with that, some of the points that have been made by Mr. Ismail Joosub. Of course, he's manager of constitutional development at the FW de Klerk Foundation. Of course, a lot of the WhatsApps that are going to come in also going to be bringing in the issue of negotiations from 1990 onwards. What happened with the land question? You hear the FW de Klerk Foundation saying there quite clearly and emphatically that they are against the Land Expropriation Act as it sits at the moment. Get in touch with us, 010-594-6010. We take a short break. We'll continue hearing from our panel some more, particularly on that matter on the other side of this. Welcome back. So on this day, 35 years ago, Nelson Mandela was freed from prison and welcomed to South Africa as a free man. The crowds that gathered just showed really what was a hopeful nation for the future. And we're keen to hear from you this evening if you feel that the hopes of 1990 certainly have been fulfilled in the 35 years that followed. Taking your WhatsApps on 072-110-5584. Let's see some of those WhatsApps that have come in this evening, those messages coming in from our viewers. Anonymous says, things are really bad and I think he wouldn't like or support what his comrades are doing now. There are a lot of mistakes that have been made and I don't like what is happening, but who am I but just an ordinary ANC member? Okay. Anonymous, thanks for that. Lauren says, I wish Mandela was around, a man of integrity, love, honesty, wisdom, and level thinking, which we do not have in the current leadership. Mandela knew how to lead without prejudice. These leaders of today must move away from greed, racism, theft, and incompetence. Lawrence, thanks for sending in that message. Kaya Somtaga says, after 35 years of being released from prison, SA is still experiencing huge oppression and poverty. We're looking at multiple explanation rise in unemployment and GBV and poverty and corruption allegations against senior government personnel and political leaders. SA is sinking bit by bit. Kaya, thanks for that message. Noko says, nothing has happened to South Africa other than the escalation of corruption and the deterioration of the economy. So those WhatsApps, as we read them this evening, not as optimistic as what we would have heard, say, from our other callers who said, okay, well, this is the sort of work that has been done right. But Mr. Maharaj, I bring you in here. The FW de Klerk Foundation says, no, we are not in support of the Land Expropriation Act as it sits. And I immediately wonder, as you think back to over 35 or over 30 years ago, what the land question actually looked like in those negotiations, and how you answer the question about the act, and if the time is now, certainly if it's been legislated the right way.
First of all, the land question was one of the issues that was center of bitter struggles at the negotiating table. The National Party, supported by the Democratic Party, opposed anything that would redistribute the land. They wanted to impose a free market economy on this country. But the position taken in the Constitution, after bitter struggles in the Constitutional Assembly, gave us the space to redress the land issue as well as many other injustices. And I think that in managing that process, the senior counsel, Muka Itobi, has written carefully researched material. And one of the errors that he points out that took place in what we tried to do from 1994 on land was to introduce what is not in the law, a willing buyer, willing seller proposition. Now, that is got rid of in this Expropriation Act. It brings in all sorts of considerations that we may do so properly within the law and justly. I have to say that everybody has a right in the country to claim that a particular law is unconstitutional. But the mere fact that you think so or that you have counsel saying so doesn't mean it is unconstitutional. That is an issue to be taken up in the courts. What is unfortunate is that even if you look at the court case that is now being taken up, is that the issue that they have claimed is unacceptable, is expropriation without compensation, is not part of the Democratic Party's court case. It is put it on a different ground. But the issue that we have to face, Naledi, is larger than that. That is why I was inviting an approach that is self-critical, that looks at ourselves. And I have to take issue with Mr. Joosub. In 1996, just as I have looked at the three-legged program, in 1996, after the National Assembly adopted that constitution with a vote of 87% in favor, Deputy President de Klerk, leader of the National Party, walked out of that government. And the reasons he gave was that he wanted that enforced coalition that was there for only 5 years to be there for another 15 years. He did not want a constitution of the type that we have, that we achieved in 1996. Now we need to look at those mistakes, because I believe, and I've long held the view, that that walkout was harmful for the country because it was necessary. The alignments politically were such that there were parties where the majority of the black people were voting on one party and the majority of the whites were voting for the Democratic and the National Party. It was imperative that these forces should be committed to that constitution and work together. That disjuncture began the process where we're still today finding the racial divide separating us on issue after issue. I need to caution ourselves. I hear the call for a national dialogue, and I think I welcome it, but I need to caution us. Because in 1995, we created an institution called NEDLAC, in which business, labor, community organization, and the government were sitting together. It was a forum created to resolve issues that should be taken up into law where these parties are at poles apart. That institution still exists. And the idea that a national dialogue, I must caution, is taking place in a different atmosphere. In 1990 to 1994, we negotiated while the National Party was ruling, and the demand was troops out of the township, stop doing all what you're doing, abolish the apartheid laws. Here today, the national dialogue, if it takes place, has to take place while governance has to continue. And therefore, we need to address what do we do at the level of governance so that we do not all pin our hopes on governance. We need to have the lessons, and we need governance to continue and redress the mistakes that are happening, that have happened. So those are the issues that I come with. And the last point on the land issue, I want to take us back to the Freedom Charter. I think it is correct that we want restitution, redress of the past injustice and dispossession, and a redistribution. I'm glad that Dr. Buthelezi has raised the question of arable land, because the land question cannot be separated from the agrarian problem. Many, many countries have gone through revolution where the immediate aftermath is a fall in the production level. And we've seen it happening in our neighboring countries. We can't afford that to happen in South Africa. So the land question has got to be addressed together with the issue of the agrarian problem. And we must make sure that this is done in a way that does not lead us into a destructive path, as we can witness in some of our fellow African countries. So those are my injunctions, but I do think that the issue of a dialogue needs to be addressed carefully, side by side. Let's attend to making sure that government today begins to govern properly and take us forward.
Yeah.
And it is unfortunate that some of the members of the GNU are still talking to different mouths when we face the challenge of Trump. We need to address problems by recognizing that there are problems that we can solve which are under our control. And there are other problems that affect us which cannot be solved by ourselves alone because we live in a world economy. And those are issues like Trump that are beyond our control. But I believe that the government today, under the President Ramaphosa, has been handling that matter with great circumspection and with firmness.
All right, Mr. Maharaj, we're running out of time, and I want to get just 2 more comments in. I'll let Dr. Chikane come in with your final thoughts. I mean, there's so much to really reflect on as we wrap up the discussion. But we know that the Nelson Mandela Foundation, in support of the signing of the Act, we know the position now. The FW de Klerk Foundation, not in support of the Act as it sits. The Ahmed Kathrada Foundation?
Yeah, so the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, when everything essentially happened, we realized that one can become quite focused on the Act, but what we don't do is realize what is the misinformation happening around the Act. The foundation has no particular issue with the Act in of itself. The issue that we have is, again, how the Act is being manipulated and utilized, the lack of understanding as citizens have of what is exactly in the Act, what are the contentious issues, what does it mean for people's everyday lives, right? For the vast majority, and when I say for the vast majority, this Act will not impact their material conditions in any particular way. But the rhetoric that has come out in multiple different avenues is as if my home that I'm living in now will be taken away from me at no expense, that I will not be compensated in any particular way. And it's just false, right? And it's this false equivalency of like linking this to broader constitutional questions that I think is a misuse of the language of the Constitution, to be completely frank about it. To adhere towards saying that I disagree with you on a constitutional level, and it has nothing to do with that. And I go back to when people make these arguments, and I liken it back to a letter that Ahmed Kathrada wrote to President Jacob Zuma during the 2010s, of essentially saying that the people's interest should always remain supreme. And whatever decision that we're making, that has to be the guiding pillar of decisions that politicians make, the decisions that citizens make, that what is the ultimate good for citizens? Otherwise, it's the same way that South Africans back in 1943 with the African Claims Act were really advocating for the return of land in 1943, that we debated this in 1994, that we're debating this in 2025, tells you that this land question is, as Mr. Maharaj said, that it is not just economic on its own, it's not just reconciliation on its own, it's not just unity on its own, it's all three together. And once South Africans realize that, you realize that there's a responsibility to not be dogmatic in your position and think about what is good for the country as a whole going forward. Not your community, not your cluster, not your creed, not your race, not your gender, but what is good for everyone. And that requires compromise. And if a problem has existed for almost 80 years and longer, going back to colonialism, and we still can't solve it now because people aren't willing to compromise, that is a bigger issue we have in our country that I think we need to resolve.
I think that's a great place for us to leave it. Gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure having you, and I really do wish we had more time. But I think to close it off, of course, we had this conversation in commemoration of 35 years since the release of Madiba. And in that speech, when he first spoke to South Africans as a free man, I wanted to pick up a line of what he said in that speech. He said, "It is only through disciplined mass action that our victory can be assured. We call on white compatriots to join us in the shaping of a new South Africa." Keen to hear our viewers' considerations as well of what came out of that monumentous speech from the former president when he was a free man. And look at some of those images. Standing beside the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, 072-110-5584. Thank you so much to Dr. Mbongiseni Buthelezi, CEO of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, Dr. Rekgotsofetse Chikane, who is the board member with the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, Ismail Joosub, who's the manager of the Constitutional Advancement at the FW de Klerk Foundation, and Mr. Mac Maharaj, politician and former anti-apartheid activist.